Hi, Professor Stott and the rest of English 301. My name is Amanda Shaw, and for the first week's assignment, it's on common sense and its limitations. So, first way to start off, in my opinion, is to understand what common sense is. So, to me, I would think common sense is you take the word common, and I would believe that the word common, based on the notes and my own experiences, is something that is widely understood by the majority of people or average people. So common sense would be like it's just something that most people happen to know. So there's many limitations based on a variety of factors that could influence what somebody perceives as common sense. So for example, I would think that somebody's background and where they come from would be, and how they were raised would be a great limitation. So a perfect example would be, say, if you grew up in a tradition, say if you took religion and you grew up in a traditional Jewish family versus a family that grew up, say, Catholic. So something an example would be for common sense would be it's common sense for a Jewish person that they do not get tattoos because you were supposed to um, leave the natural world to the next world and be in the same form that you entered the world in. So that being said, you cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery if you have any form of tattoo or body ink. So another limitation that could definitely impact what would be considered common sense would be, say, where you live. So growing up in an urban area like New York City versus a rural area like the middle of nowhere in Arkansas. So you have a lot more exposure to a lot more things if you're in an urban area where it's highly populated, very busy, versus a rural area where you may not have something for miles. So with that, you could take the example of like being alienated. So alienation versus exposure. You have a lot more exposure in certain areas and around more diverse people in certain areas versus others. Also, another limitation would be your beliefs and prejudices. So, perfect example would be if you grew up in an Asian culture, it is common sense that when you enter a school, you take off your shoes or you bow down to your elders. That's common sense in that form. However, versus in, say, America, that would not necessarily be something that's common, where you would go into a school and automatically take off your shoes. Um, so with that, there's also prejudices. So that can be influenced based on your ancestors and their experiences, and it's been passed down. So something like slavery, that was considered a common sense prejudice. So everybody, back when slavery existed, it was just widely understood that the majority owned the minority, thus being the African Americans, or even during the Holocaust when it was taken against the Jewish people. So the thing with limitations of common sense is that could be changed over time. So the perfect example with slavery, that was common sense way back in the early 1900s. However, now in 2013, we do not practice slavery. That's not considered a common law or a common thing that everybody does. So also another limitation would be one's education. If one has a very strong education, they're exposed to a lot more, they're more intelligent, things may be more common. However, say you went to and you got an education in a very secluded area, say you grew up in an Amish area, you may not have had all the technology that somebody that was in an urban area had or anything along those lines. So your education and how much you have been educated can influence that. Excuse the phone in the background. Um, so that can definitely be considered a limitation for common sense. And with that, with common sense, the whole thing to keep in mind is what's common sense for one person may not be common sense for another. So another really good example that I just happened to remember was back when I believe it was President Clinton at the time. He had gone to visit Australia, and a lot of with common sense, hand gestures can be a great example. So when he was in Australia, speaking for some event. He had done a hand gesture, and I'll attach an article separately from this that shows it, because I remember I found it to be pretty hilarious. Um, he had done a hand gesture while speaking, and he got completely condemned by many of the Australians, and they were booing at him, and he didn't realize that it was maybe something that's commonly done in America or in other areas, but it's highly offensive in an Australian area. So that's definitely considered under common sense. So I wanted to wrap this up. I had found something on a website. It was from Psychology Today. It was an article, and I thought it was pretty funny and kind of summed up what makes something common sense and its limitations. So it says, if common sense was common, the most people wouldn't make the kinds of decisions they do every day. People wouldn't buy stuff they can't afford. They wouldn't smoke cigarettes or eat junk food. They wouldn't gamble. And if you want to get really specific and timely, politicians wouldn't be tweeting pictures of their private parts to strangers. In other words, people wouldn't do the multitude of things that are clearly not good for them. And common sense isn't real sense if we define sense as being sound judgment, because relying on experience alone doesn't usually offer enough information to draw reliable conclusions. Heck, I think common sense is a contradiction in terms. Real sense can rarely be derived from experience alone, because most people's experiences are limited. So that was, again, from a Psychology Today article that was published on July 12th, 2011 by Jim Taylor, who is a PhD. And again, I will post the correct citation for that. But I thought that was a great way to sum it up, as to what makes something common sense based on one's background and how they were raised and what experiences they have had, and all of that can limit what is necessarily considered common sense versus what's not considered common sense. So again, things like that could be your background, gender, sexuality, and all of that could be based on how you were raised and your beliefs and prejudices and exposure. So there's a lot of factors and variables that can go into what makes something limited in terms of common sense as opposed to what doesn't. So I hope that answers just about the question and kind of gives you an insight as to, you kind of have to look back at yourself and see how you were raised and what ideals you were left with and brought up with, to kind of figure out what's common sense for you versus another human being. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing back.